The Starlight Ballroom on the 95th floor of the Hudson Yards Tower was less a room and more a universe unto itself. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed a sprawling, glittering tapestry of New York City at night, a view worth more than the GDP of a small nation. Inside, the air was a carefully curated blend of expensive perfume, aged scotch, and the silent, crackling energy of ambition. Men in bespoke tuxedos and women draped in jewels moved like chess pieces on a marble floor, their laughter precise and their smiles tactical. This was Julian Vance's world, a rarefied atmosphere where fortunes were made or lost on the nuance of a handshake. On the periphery of this opulent bubble, standing silently by gilded columns, were the uniformed nipped officers. They were part of the decor, as functional and overlooked as the air conditioning vents, their stoic presence a stark working-class contrast to the effortless privilege they were assigned to protect. Julian Vance, at 48, was the undisputed king of this domain. His tuxedo, a Tom Ford creation, fit him like a second skin, its sharp lines mirroring the severe cut of his jaw. He held a glass of Louis XIII cognac, but his eyes were the most intoxicating thing about him, cold and gray, like a winter sky, scanning the room with a predator's focus. He wasn't enjoying the party. He was hunting. Every conversation was a transaction, every smile a calculation. His immense success in private equity was built on a foundation of ruthless efficiency and an utter intolerance for imperfection. This outward armor of power, however, was a meticulously crafted defense against a gnawing, deeply buried fear, the terror of being seen as anything less than extraordinary, of being ordinary, of being forgotten. He judged everyone, weighing their worth and status and influence, blind to the human cost of his evaluations. The deal, a $2 billion infrastructure project in West Africa, was the night's grand prize, and it was slipping through his fingers. The key stakeholder, Monsieur Du Bois, a distinguished French diplomat with a mane of silver hair, was growing visibly agitated. His voice, sharp and laced with Parisian French, cut through the soft orchestral music. He gestured angrily towards the exit, his words a torrent of complaint about a security detail that had, in his view, overstepped. Julian, who had mastered the language of global finance, but not a word of any other, could only offer placating smiles and empty hand gestures. His frustration mounted with each incomprehensible syllable from Du Bois. The smooth, controlled facade he presented to the world began to fracture, revealing the raw, impatient arrogance simmering just beneath the surface as the diplomat threatened to walk away, taking the deal with him. It was at this critical juncture that Officer Daniel Rivera stepped forward. He moved with a quiet, unobtrusive grace, his polished shoes making no sound on the marble. His dress uniform was immaculate, his posture a study in calm authority. He addressed Julian first, his voice steady. "Sir, perhaps I can assist." But before Rivera could fully articulate his offer, Julian, incensed by the interruption from someone he deemed utterly insignificant, turned on him. The investor's voice was a whip crack in the suddenly quiet space, dripping with venomous disdain. "Please," Julian announced to the silent, watching crowd, "can someone who actually speaks the language handle this?" The words hung in the air, a public execution of dignity. A collective intake of breath was heard, and for a fleeting, unguarded second, a deep, sharp hurt flashed in Officer Rivera's eyes before being swiftly masked by a shield of pure, unwavering professionalism. The world is full of unseen heroes and unspoken stories. If you believe in looking beyond the surface, subscribe to our channel for more tales that touch the heart. Let us know in the comments what city you're watching from. Ignoring the poisoned arrow of Julian's words, Officer Rivera's posture remained unbroken. He did not offer a retort or a challenging glare. Instead, he simply held his ground with a dignity that was in itself a powerful rebuke. He offered a slight, almost imperceptible nod, an acknowledgement of the insult that also served as its dismissal. His focus shifted entirely, moving from the arrogant investor to the fuming diplomat. In that subtle turn of his body, Rivera created a new center of gravity in the room. He established a space of calm professionalism around himself and Monsieur Du Bois, effectively pushing Julian and his toxic outburst to the periphery. The onlookers who had been focused on the impending humiliation of a police officer now found themselves captivated by his quiet, unshakable composure. It was a masterclass in emotional control, a silent lesson that screamed louder than Julian's insult. The ripple effect of Julian's comment was instantaneous and devastating to his own social standing. A wave of quiet murmurs spread through the nearby clusters of guests. Eyes that had once held deference now held a glint of disdain. He saw a rival, Marcus Thorne, subtly shake his head with a smirk. The wife of a German industrialist leaned in to whisper to her husband, her gaze fixed on Julian with clear disapproval. In this world, power was paramount, but the crude, public display of prejudice was seen as a sign of weakness, a lack of control. Julian had not asserted his dominance. He had revealed his insecurity. He had broken the unwritten rules of civilized power, and the silent, collective judgment of his peers was a far more cutting punishment than any verbal reprimand could ever be. He felt his carefully constructed image beginning to crumble under the weight of their stares. Julian's initial flicker of cruel satisfaction at putting the officer in his place was quickly extinguished by this chilling social feedback. He was accustomed to being the one who judged, the one whose opinions were sought and feared. Now he was the object of scorn, his behavior dissected by the very people he sought to impress. His mind raced, attempting to recalibrate, to salvage the situation, but for the first time in years, he was at a complete loss. He watched, frozen, as Officer Rivera turned his back on him, a gesture of dismissal so complete it was as if Julian had ceased to exist. The investor felt a surge of impotent rage, followed by a bewildering sense of irrelevance. He was a ghost at his own banquet, a powerful man rendered powerless by a single act of profound grace from his intended victim. With his back to Julian, Officer Rivera addressed the French diplomat. "Monsieur l'Ambassadeur," he began, his voice calm and measured. The accent was gone, replaced by a flawless, Parisian French that flowed with an elegance and precision that was utterly breathtaking. It was not the textbook French of a student, but the rich, nuanced language of a native speaker, imbued with a natural rhythm and a deep understanding of its cultural subtleties. The sound of it was a physical shock to everyone within earshot. Jaws literally dropped. The soft music from the orchestra seemed to fade into the background, and the entire corner of the ballroom fell into a stunned, captivated silence. Julian himself felt as though the air had been punched from his lungs. The reality of what was happening was so contrary to his rigid worldview that his mind struggled to process it. Monsieur Dubois, who had been poised for a dramatic exit, stopped cold. His angry expression melted away, replaced by one of pure, unadulterated astonishment. He leaned in slightly, his eyes wide with disbelief, as if to ensure he was hearing correctly. "Vous parlez français?" he asked, his tone a mixture of surprise and immense relief. Officer Rivera offered a gentle, reassuring smile. "Oui, monsieur. C'est la langue de ma mère," he replied smoothly, acknowledging that French was his mother's tongue. This simple personal revelation instantly forged a connection between the two men, bypassing the stalled, impersonal business negotiations. It was a bridge built of shared language and mutual respect, and it was a bridge that Julian, with all his billions, had been utterly incapable of constructing. The power dynamic of the entire evening had just been irrevocably altered. Julian Vance stood paralyzed, a statue of mortification. The officer's perfect French was a symphony that mocked his own ignorance. Each mellifluous phrase that passed Rivera's lips was a judgment on his own boorish behavior. The shame was a physical sensation, a hot, searing wave that washed over him, from the soles of his expensive leather shoes to the roots of his meticulously styled hair. He felt the eyes of everyone on him, and he could only imagine their thoughts. They weren't just seeing a rude billionaire. They were seeing a fool, a man so blinded by his own prejudice that he had publicly tried to humiliate someone who possessed a skill and grace he could never hope to match. The armor of his wealth and status felt suddenly paper-thin, offering no protection from the exposure of his own profound ugliness. A memory, sharp and unwelcome, pierced through his shock. He was 12 years old, standing in the pristine lobby of a private school where he was on a scholarship. His father, A proud construction worker with calloused hands and a thick Brooklyn accent had come to pick him up. He could still hear the snickers of his new, wealthy classmates as his father called out his name, his voice echoing in the marble hall. "Hey, Jules, let's blow this popsicle stand." The shame had been a physical ache in his chest, a desperate wish for the ground to swallow him whole. He had spent the next 30 years building a fortress of wealth and power around that memory, a fortress designed to ensure no one would ever again associate him with anything common. Tonight, he had become those snickering children. That childhood wound had festered, shaping the man he became. He had equated accents with a lack of education, blue-collar work with a lack of ambition, and anything outside his polished world as inferior. It was a simple, ugly equation that had served him well in the cutthroat world of finance, allowing him to dehumanize competitors and make ruthless decisions without a second thought. He saw people not as individuals, but as assets or liabilities categorized by their schools, their zip codes, their manner of speaking. Officer Rivera, with his accent and his uniform, had been instantly filed away as a liability, an irrelevant fixture in the background of his life. A man whose opinion was worth less than the dust on his shoes. The sudden violent shattering of that categorization left him reeling in a sea of cognitive dissonance. He was forced to truly see Officer Rivera for the first time. He watched the way Rivera gestured with his hands, not with the aggressive, sharp movements of a cop, but with the fluid, expressive motions of a seasoned diplomat. He listened to the cadence of his speech, the way he effortlessly navigated complex sentence structures and idiomatic expressions in French, showing a mastery of the language that was both intellectual and instinctual. There was a quiet confidence in Rivera's eyes, a depth and intelligence that Julian had been completely blind to just minutes before. He had looked at the uniform and seen a functionary, a cog in the city's machine. Now he saw a man, and the realization of his own willful blindness was a deeply unsettling and humbling experience. The conversation between Rivera and Du Bois was no longer about the security protocol. It had evolved into something far more personal and effective. Rivera, in his flawless French, was not just explaining the rules. He was building a rapport. He validated the diplomat's frustration, acknowledging the inconvenience and showing genuine empathy for his position. "I understand completely, monsieur," Rivera said, his tone conveying sincere regret. "My mother, who came to this country from Haiti, often said that respect is a language everyone understands, even when words fail. We intended no disrespect, only to ensure your safety." This single sentence did more to de-escalate the situation than any corporate apology or financial incentive Julian could have offered. It was human, it was real, and it was profoundly effective. Julian felt a pang of something he hadn't experienced since his father's funeral, a sense of his own inadequacy. He, Julian Vance, the master of the universe, the man who could move markets with a single phone call, was utterly useless in this situation. His power, his money, his influence, they were all worthless currencies in this exchange. He had tried to solve the problem with arrogance, the only tool he knew how to wield. Rivera, on the other hand, was wielding empathy, intelligence, and cultural understanding. The contrast was stark and brutal. It laid bare the emotional poverty that existed at the heart of his material empire. He had all the wealth in the world, but in that moment he felt like the poorest man in the room. The weight of his peers' judgment continued to press down on him. He could feel their conversations shifting, the focus now entirely on the unfolding drama. He was no longer the powerful host, but the villain of the evening's unexpected theater. He imagined the stories that would be told tomorrow in boardrooms and at country clubs across the city. They would speak of his arrogance, his prejudice, and his ultimate humiliation at the hands of a common police officer. His reputation, a commodity he valued more than any stock, was taking a direct hit. He had spent a lifetime cultivating an image of untouchable success, and in less than a minute, he had single-handedly tarnished it with his own ugliness. Rivera's mention of his Haitian mother added another layer to Julian's shame. He had dismissed the officer as a simple, working-class cop, likely from a family of similar, uneducated people. The reality that Rivera was the son of an immigrant, a man who had clearly inherited a rich cultural legacy, completely upended his prejudiced assumptions. He had judged Rivera's accent as a flaw, a sign of being less than, when in fact it was evidence of a bilingual, multicultural upbringing that had given him skills and perspectives Julian could only dream of. The accent wasn't a deficit. It was a testament to a life lived in more than one world, a life richer and more complex than his own. He watched the two men, now smiling, their body language relaxed and friendly. Du Bois clapped Rivera on the shoulder, a gesture of camaraderie that would have been unthinkable just 10 minutes prior. They spoke of Haiti, of Paris, of the nuances of Creole-influenced French. It was a conversation of equals, a meeting of minds that transcended rank and uniform. Julian, standing just feet away, was completely invisible to them. He was an outsider looking in, a ghost haunting the edges of a connection he had tried to prevent, but had inadvertently caused. This feeling of exclusion was a bitter pill to swallow for a man who had always been at the center of everything. The external obstacle now was not the diplomat's anger, but Julian's own shattered credibility. Even if the deal was saved, he had lost the room. He had exposed a deep character flaw, and in his world, character, or at least the perception of it, was everything. His rivals would see this as a weakness to be exploited. His partners would question his judgment. The carefully balanced ecosystem of power and respect he had cultivated was now dangerously unstable. He knew he had to do something, not just to save the deal, but to salvage his own reputation from the wreckage of his arrogance. The path forward was unclear, but he knew it couldn't involve more bluster or threats. His internal conflict raged. A part of him, the old ingrained part, screamed at him to double down, to find a way to dismiss Rivera's skill as a fluke, to reassert his dominance, to fire the entire security firm as a show of power. It was the voice of the 12-year-old boy, desperate to distance himself from anything he perceived as common. But another voice, quieter and unfamiliar, was beginning to emerge. It was a voice that whispered of the profound emptiness he had felt just before the confrontation, a loneliness that all the money in the world couldn't fill. This new voice urged him to look at what had just happened not as a defeat, but as a lesson. He continued to observe Rivera. He noticed the slight wear on the cuff of his uniform, a sign of long hours and dedicated service. He saw the quiet watchfulness in his eyes as he scanned the room, a professionalism that had never wavered, even after being publicly insulted. He saw a man of substance, a man of quiet strength and deep-seated integrity. In that moment, Julian's carefully constructed world of superficial judgments began to collapse, and for the first time, he was seeing the world and the people in it with a terrifying and liberating clarity. The man he had insulted was, in almost every way that mattered, a better man than he was. The conversation concluded. Monsieur Du Bois, now beaming, turned to Julian. "Mr. Vance," he said, his English now perfectly clear and friendly, "you have an extraordinary man in your employ. A true diplomat." He then shook Officer Rivera's hand with genuine warmth and respect. "Merci, mon ami." "Thank you, my friend." The words, spoken directly to Rivera, but intended for Julian to hear, were the final twist of the knife in Julian's pride. The diplomat was not only staying, but he was also making it clear who had convinced him. The credit for saving the multi-billion-dollar deal belonged not to the billionaire investor, but to the uniformed officer he had tried to discard. After another moment of quiet conversation, Monsieur Du Bois rejoined his delegation, his mood completely transformed. Officer Rivera, his job done, gave Julian a single, quiet look from across the small space that separated them. It was not a look of triumph or smugness. It was not accusatory or angry. It was a look of calm, dignified knowing. It was a look that said, "I see you." And in that simple, powerful gaze, Julian felt the full weight of his actions. It was a look that stripped him bare, that saw past the tuxedo and the wealth, and into the small, frightened core of the man he was. Then, with the same quiet professionalism he had displayed all evening, Rivera turned and melted back to his post by the wall. Julian was left standing alone, the buzz of the party returning to his consciousness but feeling distant and alien. He felt profoundly isolated, adrift in a sea of his own making. The path of least resistance was to do nothing, to let the moment pass, to pretend it never happened. He could smooth things over with the diplomat, close the deal, and forget all about Officer Rivera. He could go back to his empty penthouse, surrounded by his priceless art and his crushing loneliness. It was the easy path, the one his pride and his fear were screaming for him to take. It was the path he had been on his entire adult life. But the quiet, knowing look from Rivera had planted a seed of something new. It was a challenge, not to a fight, but to his own character. It was an invitation to be better. The thought was terrifying. To apologize, to admit fault, would be to dismantle the very fortress he had spent a lifetime building. It would mean admitting that his entire system of judging people was flawed, that his success was built on a foundation of prejudice, that the 12-year-old boy was still inside him, making decisions out of fear and shame. It was a truth so profound and so painful that he wasn't sure he could face it. He took a deep breath, the expensive air of the gala, feeling thin and suffocated. He watched Rivera, who had resumed his post, standing at ease but ever watchful. He looked no different than any of the other officers lining the room, yet to Julian, he now stood out as if illuminated by a spotlight. He was a symbol of everything Julian had willfully ignored, a living embodiment of the human potential he had dismissed. In Rivera, he saw not just a man, but a mirror reflecting his own deep and profound failings. The reflection was ugly, and for the first time, he did not want to look away. He wanted to fix it. The internal battle was brief but violent. His arrogance fought a desperate rearguard action, whispering that an apology was a sign of weakness, that a man like him should never have to explain himself to a man like Rivera. It told him that power was the only thing that mattered, and he had the power. But the whispers of his pride were drowned out by the echo of Rivera's dignified silence, by the memory of his eloquent French, by the weight of that final, knowing gaze. The loneliness of his existence, a constant low hum in the background of his life, suddenly roared to the forefront. He realized that his fortress wasn't keeping others out. It was keeping him trapped inside. With a resolve that surprised even himself, he made a decision. It was not a business decision calculated for maximum return on investment. It was a human decision, born from a moment of profound and painful self-awareness. He knew what he had to do. It was not about saving the deal anymore, or even about salvaging his reputation. It was about salvaging his soul. He had to bridge the chasm his prejudice had created. He had to speak to Officer Rivera, not as an investor to a security guard, but as one man to another. He had to apologize. He subtly excused himself from a conversation with a senator, his mind clear on his objective. He started walking across the vast marble floor of the ballroom, each step feeling heavier than the last. The familiar terrain of his world suddenly felt foreign and hostile. He was acutely aware of the other guests, their glances feeling like physical blows. He wasn't walking towards a business negotiation. He was walking towards a reckoning with himself. The journey from the center of the room to its periphery, a distance of perhaps 50 feet, felt like crossing a vast and desolate desert. It was a pilgrimage of shame and a tentative first step towards redemption. He scanned the perimeter of the room, looking for Rivera. He finally spotted him standing in a slightly less crowded area, near a service corridor entrance. The officer was observing the crowd with a calm, practiced eye, completely unaware that he was the object of Julian's intense focus. For a moment, Julian hesitated. The fear and pride surged back, trying to pull him back to the safety of the known. He could still turn around. He could still retreat into his world of power and silence. But the image of Rivera's dignified face, the memory of that brief flash of hurt in his eyes, pushed him forward. He navigated through the clusters of laughing guests, his progress slow and deliberate. The orchestral music seemed to swell, providing a dramatic soundtrack to his internal turmoil. He felt like an actor in a play, moving towards a scene he had not rehearsed and for which he knew none of the lines. He was Julian Vance, a man who always had a plan, who was always 3 steps ahead. Now he was walking into the unknown, armed with nothing but a raw, unfamiliar feeling of remorse and a desperate, newfound need to make things right. His heart pounded in his chest, a frantic drumbeat against the cage of his ribs. He found Officer Rivera standing alone for a brief moment as another guard spoke into his radio. This was his chance. The corridor next to them was dimly lit and relatively secluded, offering a small pocket of privacy amidst the public spectacle of the gala. Julian adjusted his body, a nervous tic he hadn't displayed in decades. His palms were sweating. He who had faced down hostile corporate boards and ruthless international financiers without flinching was terrified of speaking to this police officer. He was terrified of the man he would see in Rivera's eyes when he finally stood before him. He approached slowly, so as not to startle him. Rivera, sensing his presence, turned his head. Their eyes met. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The air between them was thick with the unspoken words of the evening, with the insult and the shame. Julian saw no anger in Rivera's expression, only a calm, patient neutrality. He was waiting. This simple act of waiting, of giving Julian the space to speak, was yet another act of quiet grace. It disarmed Julian completely, stripping away the last vestiges of his defensive arrogance. He was exposed, vulnerable, and ready to face the consequences of his actions. The noise of the gala seemed to recede into a distant hum. In the small, private space between the two men, there was only a profound and heavy silence. Julian opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his throat. What could he possibly say that would be adequate? How could he articulate the seismic shift that had just occurred within him? He looked at the man he had so casually and cruelly dismissed, and he saw not an obstacle or an inferior, but a teacher. He was about to receive the most important lesson of his life, and the tuition was his own deeply entrenched pride. This moment stretched, suspended in time. Julian's internal world was in chaos, a storm of regret and newfound humility. He was a man who had built his life on the certainty of his own superiority, and that foundation had been utterly demolished. Now he had to rebuild, starting with this single, difficult conversation. He was taking the first step off the lonely pedestal he had constructed for himself and onto the common ground of shared humanity. The journey would be long and arduous, but it had to begin here, in this hallway, with a simple, honest admission of his own fallibility. He thought of his father again, not with shame, but with a sudden, aching clarity. He remembered his father's rough hands, not as a symbol of a lower class, but as a symbol of hard work and sacrifice, the hands that had paid for the scholarship to the private school Julian had been so ashamed of. He had spent his life running from his father's world, only to realize now that he had been running from the best parts of himself, the potential for honesty, integrity, and simple human decency. He had traded it all for a hollow crown. The officer's gaze remained steady, patient. He did not prompt Julian or show any sign of impatience. He simply stood, a silent witness to the rich man's internal struggle. This quietude was Rivera's greatest strength. He had absorbed the insult without retaliation, and now he was absorbing the ensuing silence with the same unwavering composure. He was allowing Julian the space to find his own words, to arrive at his own apology in his own time. It was a gesture of immense emotional intelligence, a final, unspoken lesson in the art of being a man. Julian finally found his voice, not the booming, confident voice of the boardroom, but a quieter, more hesitant version. As he prepared to speak, Julian understood that this was more than an apology. It was a surrender. He was surrendering his prejudice, his arrogance, and the false sense of security they provided. He was surrendering to the terrifying and beautiful truth that he was no better than anyone else, that a person's worth was not measured by their bank account or their accent. It was a truth that Officer Rivera had demonstrated not with words, but with his character. The first step was to acknowledge that truth, not just to Rivera, but to himself. He met Rivera's eyes, and for the first time that evening, he was not performing. He was not calculating or negotiating. He was simply present, a man stripped of his titles and his wealth, standing before another man he had wronged. The power dynamic had been completely inverted. Rivera, the officer on the periphery, now held all the power. Not the power of wealth or status, but the moral power that comes from integrity and grace under fire. Julian was the one who was vulnerable, the one who needed something: forgiveness. The weight of his past actions, his casual cruelties, his lifetime of dismissive judgments, all seemed to coalesce in this single moment. He felt the crushing burden of his own character. He had built an empire, but he had neglected to build a soul. The man standing before him, a man he had deemed worthless just an hour ago, was now offering him a chance to start. A chance to be more than just a collection of assets and achievements. A chance to be a good man. It was a chance he knew he could not afford to waste. He saw the subtle shift in the crowd behind Rivera, people beginning to notice the quiet confrontation happening in the corridor. A few curious glances were thrown their way. This added a new layer of urgency. This apology could not be a private affair that he could later deny or downplay. It had to be a genuine act of contrition, performed on the same stage where he had committed the original sin. The social pressure that had earlier shamed him now became a force for good, pushing him to follow through on his newfound conviction. He could not retreat now. Julian's mind cleared. The fear and hesitation receded, replaced by a simple, stark necessity. He had to repair the damage he had caused, not just to Rivera's dignity, but to his own. He thought about the ripple effect of his words, how they had poisoned the atmosphere, how they had revealed a rotten core beneath his polished exterior. He realized that an apology was not just about making the other person feel better. It was about acknowledging a shared humanity, about restoring a broken connection. It was the first step in healing a wound that he himself had inflicted. He focused on Rivera's face, on the calm, steady brown eyes that had seen his worst and had not flinched. There was a story in those eyes, a history of struggle and resilience that Julian was only now beginning to appreciate. This was not just a police officer. This was a man who had navigated a world that likely judged him at every turn, a world that Julian himself had helped to create and perpetuate. The scope of his own ignorance was staggering, and he felt a profound sense of sorrow for the countless other people he had likely dismissed and undervalued throughout his life. The final barrier of his pride crumbled into dust. It no longer mattered what his rivals thought, or what the gossip columns might say tomorrow. All that mattered was the man standing in front of him. All that mattered was doing the right thing, for no other reason than it was the right thing to do. This was the moment of truth, the pivot point upon which the rest of his life could turn. He could continue his trajectory as a wealthy, powerful, and desperately lonely man, or he could choose a different path, one that started with humility. He took a final, steadying breath. The clamor of the party, the weight of his reputation, the ghost of his father, all of it faded away, leaving only the quiet intensity of the moment. It was just him and Officer Rivera, two men from different worlds, brought together by an act of cruelty and now bound by the possibility of grace. The scene was set, the internal conflict had reached its turning point, and the path to redemption, however narrow and difficult, was now clear. He was ready to speak. He finally broke the silence, his voice barely above a whisper, yet carrying the weight of a lifetime of unexamined prejudice. It was a voice stripped of its usual authority, filled instead with a raw, unfamiliar vulnerability. He began with the only word that mattered, the word that his pride had fought so hard to suppress. It was a simple word, but in this context, it was the most powerful and transformative word he could possibly utter. He looked Officer Rivera directly in the eye, offering no excuses, only the unvarnished truth of his regret. The silence that followed his first word was different. It was no longer heavy with tension, but filled with a fragile, nascent hope. The emotional dam within Julian had broken, and now the long and difficult process of atonement could begin. He stood there, waiting for a response, prepared for any reaction: anger, dismissal, or even contempt. He knew he deserved it all, but he also held onto a sliver of hope that the grace Officer Rivera had shown in the face of public humiliation might extend to this private moment of confession. The next move was not his. He had ceded control, a terrifying and liberating act for a man who had spent his entire life orchestrating every outcome. He had placed his fate, or at least his sense of self-worth, into the hands of the man he had wronged. This complete reversal of their initial dynamic was the crux of his transformation. He was no longer the master puppeteer, but a supplicant, asking for something he knew he had not earned and did not deserve: a second chance. The air in the corridor crackled with unspoken possibility as he waited for Officer Rivera's response. Julian thought about the word value. He had always measured it in dollars, in market share, in assets. He had valued people based on their utility to him, their ability to increase his own wealth and status. Now he was confronted with a different kind of value, an intrinsic human worth that had nothing to do with money. Officer Rivera possessed this value in abundance. His wealth was in his character, his integrity, his multilingualism, his quiet dignity. Julian realized with a sickening certainty that by his own old metrics, he was the one who was truly bankrupt. He braced himself for the officer's reply. He replayed his own cruel words in his head one last time. Can someone who actually speaks the language handle this? The arrogance of it, the sheer, unadulterated ugliness of the sentiment, made him physically flinch. He had not just insulted a man. He had insulted his heritage, his family, his entire life story, all without knowing a single thing about him. The apology he was about to offer felt woefully inadequate to cover the depth of the offense, but he knew it was the only place to start. He met Rivera's gaze again, and this time he let his own mask fall away completely. He let the officer see the shame, the regret, the desperate plea for understanding in his eyes. It was the most honest he had been with another human being in years, perhaps ever. The gala, the deal, the entire glittering, superficial world he had built for himself seemed to fade into insignificance. In this quiet corridor, under the watchful gaze of a uniformed officer, Julian Vance was finally confronting the truth of who he was and the man he desperately, suddenly, wanted to become. Julian's voice, when it finally emerged, was a foreign sound in his own ears. It was quiet, strained, and devoid of its usual booming confidence. "Officer," he began, the single word costing him an immense amount of pride. He forced himself to hold Rivera's gaze, refusing to let his own shame make him look away. This had to be faced head-on. What I said back there, what I did, was inexcusable. He paused, the noise of the gala seeming to fade into a dull roar, the corridor becoming a sanctuary of confession. The air grew still, charged with the weight of his admission. He saw no change in Rivera's calm expression, which only made the act of apologizing more difficult and more necessary. He was not being let off the hook by anger. He was being held accountable by grace. He pushed forward, the words tumbling out in a raw, unpracticed flow. "I made an assumption, a disgusting, arrogant assumption based on nothing." He shook his head, a gesture of self-loathing. "I judged you by the way you spoke, by your uniform, and in the end, I was the one who came up short. I was the one who lacked eloquence, who lacked character." He finally broke eye contact, his gaze dropping to the polished marble floor, unable to bear witness to the reflection of his own failure in the other man's eyes. The confession left him feeling hollowed out, stripped of the armor of his arrogance, leaving only the vulnerable, flawed man beneath. It was the most honest he had ever been, and the silence that followed was deafening. Officer Rivera did not respond immediately. He simply listened, his posture relaxed, but his attention absolute. He let Julian's words hang in the space between them, giving them the gravity they deserved. For Julian, this silence was a form of torture, a void in which his mind conjured every possible negative reaction: scorn, dismissal, a cold and unforgiving rejection. He braced himself for a lecture, for a deserved tirade on his bigotry. He had given Rivera the power, and he was now at the mercy of how the officer chose to wield it. This deliberate pause was a final, subtle test of his sincerity. It forced Julian to sit with the discomfort of his actions, to truly feel the weight of the wound he had inflicted without the immediate relief of forgiveness. When Rivera finally spoke, his voice was as calm and measured as it had been when he was speaking French. There was no trace of bitterness, only a profound, weary wisdom. "I accept your apology, Mr. Vance." He said it simply, without flourish. He then tilted his head slightly, a thoughtful expression on his face. "Words can be weapons. I've been on the receiving end of them many times, not just for my accent, but for the color of my skin, for the uniform I wear. He wasn't seeking pity. He was stating a fact, broadening the scope of Julian's apology from a single incident to a systemic issue. He was gently forcing Julian to see beyond his own personal failure and to recognize the wider world of prejudice he participated in. My mother, Rivera continued, his eyes taking on a distant, softer look. She was a nurse who came here from Port-au-Prince. She worked 2 jobs, learned English by watching television at night, and she raised 2 sons by herself. She knew the sting of being judged. He paused, the memory clearly vivid in his mind. She used to tell my brother and me, in her beautiful mix of Creole and French, that respect is a language everyone understands. She taught us that a person's worth isn't in their wallet or their accent, but in how they treat the person who can do nothing for them. That is the true measure of a man. The simple, powerful philosophy stood in stark contrast to Julian's entire life's work. That story, that simple piece of inherited wisdom, struck Julian with the force of a physical blow. It was so clear, so fundamentally right, that it made his own complex justifications for his behavior seem pathetic and childish. Respect is a language everyone understands. The phrase echoed in his mind, dismantling his decades-long belief that power was the only universal language. He looked at Rivera, a man shaped by a mother's love and resilient dignity, and felt a profound sense of envy. Rivera had inherited a wealth of character, a legacy of integrity that Julian, for all his billions, could never purchase. It was a treasure passed down through struggle and love, and it was priceless. A genuine curiosity, an emotion Julian rarely felt about others, flickered to life within him. He found himself wanting to know more, not as a tactic, but as a real desire to understand. "Your mother," he said, his voice softer now. "She sounds like an incredible woman. She taught you French?" The question was a small offering, a tentative step onto the common ground of shared human experience. It was the first time he had ever asked a question to which he didn't already think he knew the answer. He was no longer an interrogator seeking leverage, but a student seeking knowledge. This small shift marked the true beginning of his transformation, the pivot from shame to a desire for genuine connection. Rivera offered a small, sad smile. She did. She wanted to make sure we never forgot where we came from. She said it was a gift, to have more than one world inside you. He glanced away for a moment. She passed away 5 years ago, but I still hear her voice every day, especially on days like this. She would have been. Amused by the situation, there was a depth of love and loss in that brief statement that resonated in the quiet corridor. In sharing that piece of his history, Rivera was offering Julian a glimpse into his own humanity, a gift of vulnerability that went far beyond a simple acceptance of an apology. It was an act of profound generosity. This unexpected intimacy emboldened Julian, compelling him to offer a piece of his own broken history in return. The exchange felt suddenly reciprocal, a confession for a confession. "My father," Julian started, the words tasting like rust in his mouth, was a construction worker. He had a thick accent. I was ashamed of him, ashamed of where I came from. The admission was painful, a verbalization of a secret shame he had carried his entire life. I spent my whole life running from that, building walls of money, and this. He gestured vaguely at his tuxedo at the opulent gala beyond the hallway. I became the very thing I hated as a boy, a bully who judges people by how they sound. Rivera listened to this broken confession with an expression of deep empathy. There was no judgment in his eyes, only a quiet understanding of the complex, often painful motivations that drive human beings. He saw past the billionaire and recognized the insecure 12-year-old boy Julian had just described. "We all carry something, Mr. Vance," he said softly. "The trick is not letting it make us carry it for others." This simple, powerful statement of shared fallibility was perhaps the greatest gift Rivera could have given him. It wasn't absolution, but it was understanding. It was an acknowledgement that Julian's flaw, while ugly, was not unique. It was human. In that moment, the formal titles and invisible barriers between them completely dissolved. The vast social and economic chasm that separated Julian Vance, the titan of industry, from Daniel Rivera, the nipped officer, vanished. They were simply two men, standing in a hallway, sharing the common burdens of their pasts. The apology had cracked open the door to a genuine human connection, and this shared vulnerability had swung it wide open. Julian felt a profound sense of relief, a loosening of a knot in his chest he hadn't even realized he was carrying. He was no longer alone in his gilded cage. An overwhelming, almost desperate need to act, to do something tangible to repay this unexpected kindness, surged through Julian. "Is there anything I can do?" he asked, the question feeling clumsy and inadequate. "For you, I mean. A commendation. Anything. Please." It was the language he understood: transactions, rewards, gestures of power. He was reaching for his old tools to solve a new kind of problem, not yet fully understanding that some things couldn't be bought or arranged. He wanted to fix it, to make it right in the only way he knew how, by leveraging his influence to bestow a favor upon the man he had wronged. Rivera's response was gentle but firm, a quiet rejection of Julian's transactional worldview. "You've already done it, Mr. Vance," he said, his gaze steady and clear. "You came here and you apologized. Honestly, you have no idea how rare that is." He shook his head slightly. "I don't need a commendation. My reward is doing my job and going home to my family at the end of my shift. That's all I've ever wanted." This statement of simple, profound contentment was a revelation to Julian. It highlighted the emptiness of his own relentless pursuit of more, showing him that true wealth lay in things he had long forgotten how to value: duty, family, and peace of mind. Seeing the lingering desire to do something in Julian's eyes, Rivera offered him a different kind of task, a purpose. "But if you really want to do something," he said, his voice dropping slightly, becoming more intense, "don't do it for me. Do it for the next person you meet." He leaned in just a fraction, his gaze locking with Julian's. "The next person with an accent, or a uniform, or a job you don't think is important. Just see them. Really see them as a person. That's it. That would be more than enough." It was not a request, but a commission, a charge to carry the lesson of this night forward. The conversation had reached its natural conclusion. There was nothing more to be said. The apology had been offered and accepted. A connection had been forged in the crucible of shame and empathy. Julian, feeling a sense of clarity and purpose he had not felt in years, did the only thing that felt right. He extended his right hand. It was a gesture he had made thousands of times in his life, to seal deals, to greet presidents, to assert dominance. But this time, it was different. It was not a gesture of power, but of humility. It was a plea for peace, an offering of respect. Rivera looked at the outstretched hand for a moment before taking it firmly in his own. The grip was strong, confident, the handshake of a man secure in who he was. Their eyes met one final time, and in that shared glance, a silent pact was made. It was a promise from Julian to remember the lesson, and an acknowledgement from Rivera that he believed Julian was capable of change. No more words were necessary. The handshake was the seal on their transformative encounter, a physical manifestation of the bridge that had been built between their two disparate worlds. The climax was over. The healing had begun. With a final, small nod of mutual respect, Officer Rivera released his hand. "I have to get back to my post," he said, his voice returning to its professional, official tone. He turned without another word and walked back towards the glittering ballroom, his duty calling him back to the world where he was meant to be invisible. Julian watched him go, the sight of his retreating, uniformed back now representing not a social inferior, but a figure of immense moral stature. He was left alone in the quiet of the corridor, the echo of their conversation reverberating in his soul. He was a different man than the one who had walked into this hallway just a few minutes ago, profoundly and irrevocably changed. When Julian returned to the main ballroom, the glittering facade of the event no longer held any power over him. The change was not outwardly dramatic, but it was profound. He moved with a new, quieter purpose, his eyes no longer scanning for opportunities but for individuals. He approached Monsieur Dubois, and with a calm, genuine warmth that surprised the diplomat, he finalized the terms of their deal. The victory felt hollow, a ghost of a thrill compared to the raw, terrifying, and ultimately liberating experience he just had in the corridor. As they shook hands, Julian looked past the diplomat and saw Officer Rivera back at his post, a silent guardian of a peace he had just personally restored. The real deal, Julian understood, had not been for infrastructure in Africa, but for the reconstruction of his own soul. As the opulent evening began to wind down and the elite guests started their slow, self-important exit, Julian remained behind. He stood near the wall, simply watching. For the first time in his life, he saw the invisible army that made his world possible. He saw the tired faces of the catering staff as they cleared away half-eaten plates of exquisite food. He saw the cleaning crew waiting in the wings, their equipment ready to erase any trace of the night's extravagance. He saw the valet drivers shivering in the cold night air. Each person was a story, a life as complex and important as his own, a universe of hopes and struggles he had never bothered to notice. His world had not changed, but his eyes had. The next morning, the view of Central Park from his penthouse office seemed different. The city below was not just a collection of assets and real estate holdings. It was a living, breathing organism of 8 million stories. He sat at his massive obsidian desk, the hub of his financial empire, and ignored the blinking lights of the stock market ticker. His first call was not to his traders in Tokyo or London, but to his chief legal counsel. "I want to set up a foundation," he said, his voice firm and clear, leaving no room for argument. "A non-profit. I want the paperwork drafted by the end of the day. The primary mission will be educational scholarships." The lawyer was stunned into silence. His second call was to a powerful city official, a man who owed him several favors. In the past, Julian would have cashed in such a chip for a zoning variance or a tax break. Today, his request was different. "There was an officer at the Hudson Yards Gala last night," he began. "Daniel Rivera. I want him to receive the commissioner's commendation for exceptional conduct. He single-handedly saved a multi-billion-dollar international deal through sheer diplomatic skill." He paused, adding the most important part. "And my name is not to be associated with it in any way. This is about his merit, not my influence." He was finally using his power not to elevate himself, but to deservedly honor another. Within a week, the Vance Foundation was officially incorporated. It was the only vanity he allowed himself in the project, keeping the family name he had once been so desperate to elevate through wealth alone. Now it would be elevated through service. The foundation's charter was clear and specific, a direct result of the lesson he had learned. Its mission was to provide comprehensive scholarships for language and cultural education to the children of New York City's first responders and immigrant families. It was a tangible, meaningful way to honor the legacy of Officer Rivera's Haitian mother and the countless other parents who fought to give their children the gift of multiple worlds. Julian personally drafted the foundation's mission statement, agonizing over every word. The final version was carved into a simple plaque in the foundation's new, unpretentious office in a downtown building. It read, "Dedicated to the idea that our city's greatest strength lies in its diverse voices. We seek to empower the next generation by providing the tools of communication, cultural understanding, and empathy. Because we believe that respect is the one universal language, and true value is found in building bridges, not walls." The words were a public declaration of his new creed, a promise to himself and to the city that he would spend the rest of his life making amends for his past blindness. His life began to follow a new rhythm. The relentless pursuit of the next billion was replaced by a different kind of ambition. He still ran his firm, but he delegated more, his focus shifting to the foundation. He spent his afternoons not in sterile boardrooms, but in community centers in the Bronx and Queens, listening to the stories of the people his foundation aimed to serve. He met parents who worked multiple jobs, their dreams now resting on the shoulders of their children. He saw the same resilience and hope in their eyes that he had seen in Rivera's. These encounters were more rewarding than any successful IPO had ever been. A month after their encounter, Julian reached out to Officer Rivera. He didn't send a messenger or an assistant. He called him directly. He didn't offer money or a gift. He offered a position. "I've started a foundation," he explained, "and its mission is based on the lesson you taught me. But I'm just a beginner in this world. The foundation needs a moral compass. It needs your integrity. I'd be honored if you would consider joining the advisory board." The request was an acknowledgement of their new reality. They were equals. Julian was asking for Rivera's help, admitting he couldn't do it alone. To Julian's immense relief, Rivera accepted. He saw the sincerity in the offer and the potential for real positive change. Their first board meeting was not held in a skyscraper, but in a rented room at a public library. Julian Vance, in a simple suit, sat across from Daniel Rivera, who was off duty and wearing jeans and a sweater. They were joined by community leaders, educators, and immigrant advocates. Looking at Rivera across the table, Julian saw not just the man who had saved his deal, but the man who had saved him from himself. Their unlikely partnership was now the bedrock of a new enterprise, one that measured its profits in lives changed. Julian Vance had finally learned that the greatest assets are not listed on the stock exchange. They are found in the untapped potential of people, in the rich cultural tapestries of a diverse city, and in the simple, profound power of human connection. He understood that his vast wealth had been a fortress, isolating him from the world. Now it was a tool, a resource to be deployed in the service of others. His new philosophy was simple. True strength isn't found in looking down on others, but in lifting them up. He had lost his arrogance, but had found his purpose, and in doing so, had become the richest man he had ever been. 2 years later, the sun set over a vibrant, working-class neighborhood in Brooklyn. A crowd had gathered for the dedication of the first Vance Foundation Language and Arts Center, a beautifully renovated building that was already a bustling hub for local children. On the small stage stood Julian Vance, looking more relaxed and genuinely happy than he had ever been. Beside him stood Detective Daniel Rivera, his recent promotion a testament to his continued excellence. Julian stepped to the podium, a warm smile on his face. "We are here today because of a lesson I learned," he began, "a lesson in humility taught to me by the man standing beside me. Please welcome my friend, the true inspiration for this center, Detective Rivera." They shared a look of deep, genuine friendship as Rivera took the podium to thunderous applause. After a few words of thanks, he introduced the foundation's first scholarship recipient, a 17-year-old girl, the daughter of a Dominican immigrant who worked as a paramedic, stepped forward. She stood tall and confident, a symbol of the foundation's promise. She looked out at the diverse crowd, took a deep breath, and began her welcome speech, her voice clear and strong. She delivered the first half in flawless, eloquent French, a beautiful tribute to the story that had started it all, before seamlessly switching to perfect, confident English, embodying the bridge between worlds that the center was built to create. What is the one lesson you believe the world needs most right now? Share your thoughts below. Leave a little heart if you believe love is more powerful than any wealth. Subscribe for more second chance stories. Comment love is priceless if you also believe in human kindness.